I buried a man who was already in the ground. Not metaphorically. I mean, I dug a grave, lowered a casket, and filled it in, only to find out later that the exact same body had been interred in that exact same plot 3 weeks earlier. My name is Nathan Phillips, and I've been a cemetery groundskeeper and gravedigger at Elmwood Memorial Gardens in Fort Wayne, Indiana for 11 years. I'm not some superstitious guy who jumps at shadows. I operate a backhoe, maintain drainage systems, and coordinate with funeral directors. It's physical work, it's methodical, and it follows a very specific set of procedures. What happened last March violated every single one of those procedures, and I still don't have an explanation that makes any sense. Fort Wayne gets cold in early spring. The ground is barely thawed by mid-March, which makes digging difficult. Frost heaves mess with the plots, and you have to be careful about cave-ins. Elmwood Memorial is one of the older cemeteries in the area, established in 1902. So we've got sections with subsidence issues, tree roots that disrupt the grid, and drainage problems that require constant monitoring. I know every section, every quirk of the land. I've dug over 400 graves in my time there. The day started normally. I clocked in at 6:47 a.m., checked the schedule posted in the maintenance shed, and saw we had 2 burials that day. The first was at 10 in the morning in Section D, Row 14, Plot 23. The second was at 2 in the afternoon in Section G. I grabbed my tools, fired up the backhoe, and headed out to D1423 to start the excavation. Elmwood uses a grid system. Each section is lettered, each row numbered, and each plot within that row numbered sequentially. D1423 meant Section D, Row 14, Plot 23. I've done this thousands of times. I checked the plot map twice. I measured the distance from the section marker. I confirmed the adjacent headstones matched the layout on my sheet. Everything checked out. The ground was firm but workable. I excavated down to the standard 6 feet, squared off the corners, and made sure the base was level. By 9:30, the grave was ready. The funeral party arrived around 10:15. Small group, maybe 15 people. The funeral director was a guy named Lucas Perry from Haven Rest Funeral Home. I'd worked with him dozens of times. Professional, efficient, never an issue. They held the service. I stood back by the equipment, waiting. When they finished, Lucas signaled me, and I operated the lowering device to bring the casket down into the grave. Standard procedure. Once the family left, I backfilled the plot, tamped it down, and covered it with the temporary sod until the permanent marker could be installed. Job done by 11:20. I moved on to the second burial without giving it another thought. That evening, around 4:45, I was locking up the shed when Lucas Perry pulled into the service drive in his van. He looked confused. Not upset, just confused. He got out and walked over to me, holding a clipboard. "Nathan, quick question," he said. "D1423 today. Did you have any issues with that plot?" "No," I said. "Why?" He frowned and tapped his clipboard. "I'm trying to reconcile my records. I've got that same plot marked as occupied from a service 3 weeks ago, March 2nd. I stared at him. "That's not possible. I dug that grave this morning. It was empty." Lucas shook his head. "I'm not saying you didn't dig it. I'm saying I have a signed interment certificate from March 2nd for that exact location. Same section, same row, same plot number." I pulled out my own work order. "Look, D1423, right here, scheduled for today, March 23rd. I dug it myself this morning." He held up his paperwork. "And I've got a certificate dated March 2nd for a Walter Henning, same plot." We stood there in the cold, both of us holding documents that couldn't both be true. "Maybe it's a clerical error," I said. "Someone wrote down the wrong plot number." Lucas didn't look convinced. "Maybe, but I was at that service. I remember it. It was raining, early March rain, that cold kind, and I'm pretty sure it was Section D." "You want to check the records in the office?" I asked. He nodded. We walked over to the administration building. The office manager, Olivia Brooks, had already left for the day, but I had a key. I unlocked the door and we went inside. The plot registry is kept in a large leather-bound ledger, old school, but Elmwood's been using the same system since the 60s. We also have digital records, but the ledger is considered the official document. I flipped to Section D, Row 14, and ran my finger down to plot 23. There were two entries. The first entry was dated March 2nd, 2024. Name, Walter Henning. Interment certificate signed by Lucas Perry. Grave dug by Nathan Phillips. The second entry was dated March 23, 2024. Name, Donald K. Teng. Interment certificate signed by Lucas Perry. Grave dug by Nathan Phillips. I read it twice. Lucas read it over my shoulder. "That's impossible," I said. Lucas pointed at the first entry. "That's my signature. That's my handwriting." I pointed at both entries, and those are both my initials. I signed off on both. But I had no memory of digging a grave on March 2nd. I checked my phone calendar. March 2nd had been a Saturday. I'd worked that day. I remembered it clearly because we'd had 3 services scheduled, all in different sections, but none of them had been in Section D. "Let me check the work orders," I said. I pulled the file drawer and found the folder for early March. I flipped through the carbon copy work orders until I found March 2nd. 3 burials, Section B, Row 9, Plot 8, Section F, Row 22, Plot 15, Section G, Row 3, Plot 31. No Section D. "There's no work order for D1423 on March 2nd, I said. Lucas pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. "I've got the service details right here. Havenrest handled the arrangements. Service was at 11 a.m. on March 2nd. Elmwood Memorial Gardens, Section D, Row 14, Plot 23. He turned his phone toward me. The email was there. Time-stamped March 1st. Confirmed for March 2nd. I felt a tightness in my chest. "Lucas, I'm telling you, I did not dig that grave." "Then who did?" I didn't have an answer. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then Lucas said, "We need to check the plot." I looked at him. "You mean dig it up?" "No, I mean just look at it. See if there's any sign it was disturbed before today." It was almost dark outside, but I grabbed a flashlight and we walked back out to Section D. The temperature had dropped. Our breath misted in the air. The cemetery was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees. We reached D1423. The fresh dirt was obvious, dark and mounded slightly above the surrounding ground. I'd covered it with sod strips, but you could still see the outline of the grave. Lucas knelt down and examined the edges. If this was dug 3 weeks ago, there'd be settling. The ground would have compacted. "It would have," I agreed. He pressed his hand against the soil. "This is fresh, no question." I shone the flashlight over the surrounding area. The adjacent plots were older, grass grown in, headstones weathered. No signs of recent disturbance anywhere except the plot we'd filled that morning. "So either your records are wrong," I said, "or something else is going on." Lucas stood up and brushed the dirt off his hands. "Let me make some calls. I'll check with the family from March 2nd. See if they remember anything unusual. And I'll check with Olivia tomorrow," I said. "See if she remembers processing 2 interments for the same plot." We agreed to follow up and went our separate ways. I drove home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the ledger. 2 entries. Both with my initials. Both with Lucas's signature. But only one grave dug. The next morning I got to Elmwood early, before 6. I wanted to look at D1423 again in daylight. I parked near the maintenance shed and walked out to Section D. The grave looked the same. Fresh dirt, sod strips, nothing unusual. But as I stood there, I noticed something. The headstone for the plot directly to the left, D1422, had a name I recognized. Walter Henning. I felt my stomach drop. I pulled out my phone and checked the ledger photo I'd taken the night before. The first entry in D1423 was for Walter Henning, but the headstone was in D1422. I walked over to D1422. The stone was old, weathered granite, installed decades ago. The dates showed Walter Henning had died in 1987, but the ledger said he'd been interred in D1423 3 weeks ago. I pulled out my phone and called Lucas. It went to voicemail. I left a message asking him to call me back as soon as possible. Then I went to the office. Olivia was already there, sorting through paperwork. "Olivia," I said, "I need to ask you about something." She looked up. "What's up?" I explained the situation, the duplicate entries, the conflicting records, the headstone in the wrong plot. She frowned. That doesn't make sense. Let me check the digital records. She pulled up the cemetery database on her computer and searched for D1423. One entry appeared, dated March 23, 2024, Donald Sutherland. No mention of Walter Henning, no entry for March 2nd. There's only one record in the system, she said. I showed her the photo of the ledger. She stared at it. I don't understand, she said. The ledger is supposed to match the digital records exactly. If there's a discrepancy, it means someone made a manual entry without logging it in the system. Who would do that? I asked. No one. That's not procedure. She stood up and walked over to the filing cabinet where the ledger was kept. She pulled it out and opened it to Section D, Row 14. She flipped to Plot 23. One entry, March 23, 2024, Donald Sutherland. I grabbed the ledger and looked at it myself. The entry for Walter Henning was gone. It was there last night, I said. Lucas saw it too. Olivia looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Nathan, there's only one entry. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photo. She looked at the screen, then at the ledger, then back at the screen. I don't know what to tell you, she said quietly. I called Lucas again. This time he answered. Nathan, I was just about to call you, he said. I talked to the family. Walter Henning's daughter. She said her father was buried in 1987. She has no idea what I'm talking about regarding a service on March 2nd. Lucas, the ledger entry is gone. Silence. What do you mean gone? I mean, I went back this morning, and the entry isn't there anymore. It's just gone. More silence. That's not possible, he said. I know, but I took a photo last night. It was there. Now it's not. Send me the photo. I texted it to him. A few seconds later, he called back. I see it, he said. That's my signature. That's the entry we both saw. But it's not in the ledger anymore. He didn't respond for a long moment. Then he said, I'm coming over. 20 minutes later, Lucas arrived. We sat in the office with Olivia and went through everything again. The photo, the ledger, the digital records, the headstone in D1422. There has to be a rational explanation, Olivia said. Like what? I asked. She didn't have an answer. Lucas stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the cemetery. What if someone made a mistake in 1987? What if Walter Henning was supposed to be in D1423, but they put him in D1422 by accident? That still doesn't explain the ledger entry from March 2nd, I said, or why it disappeared. Could someone have broken in and altered the ledger? Lucas asked. Olivia shook her head. The building was locked, and even if someone did, why? What's the motive? We didn't have an answer. Lucas left around noon. I spent the rest of the day trying to work, but I couldn't focus. Every time I walked past Section D, I felt a pull to go look at the grave again. Around 3 in the afternoon, I gave in. I walked out to D1423. The grave looked the same, but as I stood there, I heard something. A sound from below. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a faint rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. I froze. The sound stopped. I waited, listened. Nothing. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the ground. The tapping started again. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. Then 3 more knocks. I stood up fast, my heart pounding. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts. But I also know what I heard. I walked back to the shed, grabbed a shovel, and returned to the grave. I knew this was insane. I knew I could lose my job, but I had to know. I started digging. I excavated down about 2 feet when my shovel hit something solid. I cleared away the dirt. It was a casket, the one we'd lowered that morning. I kept digging around the edges, clearing more dirt. Then I dug deeper along one side. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something else. Another casket. I stopped digging. My hands were shaking. I cleared enough dirt to see the top of the second casket. It was older. The wood was darker, more weathered. The brass handles were tarnished. I climbed out of the grave and called Lucas. He didn't answer. I called Olivia. No answer. I stood there alone in the cemetery as the sun started to set. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, I filled the grave back in. I didn't know what else to do. That night, I went home and pulled up every record I could find on Walter Henning. According to the county death records, he died on October 14, 1987. Heart attack. He was buried at Elmwood Memorial Gardens 3 days later. I found his obituary in the Fort Wayne newspaper archives. Survived by his wife and 2 daughters. Services handled by Haven Rest Funeral Home. The same funeral home Lucas worked for. I called Lucas again. This time he answered. "I found another casket," I said. "What?" "Under the one we buried today, there's another casket in that grave." Lucas didn't respond. "Did you hear me?" I asked. "I heard you," he said quietly. "Nathan, I need to tell you something." I waited. "I looked up Walter Henning in our records," he said. "We did handle his funeral. October 1987. But here's the thing. There's a note in the file. It says the burial was delayed. Delayed how? It doesn't say. Just that there was a delay between the service and the interment. The family held the service on October 17th, but the burial didn't happen until November 9th. 3 weeks later," I said. "Yeah, why?" The note doesn't explain. But there's a name attached to the authorization for the delay. Cemetery groundskeeper. Guy named Michael Butler. I felt cold. I knew Michael. He retired in 2015. Trained me when I first started. Is he still around? He moved to Florida, but I have his number. I called Michael that night. He answered on the 3rd ring. I explained who I was and asked if he remembered Walter Henning. There was a long silence. "Why are you asking about that?" he said finally. "Because something strange is happening with his plot." Another silence. "Michael, I hope no one would ever have to deal with that again," he said. "Deal with what?" he sighed. "Walter Henning was supposed to be buried on October 17th, 1987. I dug the grave the day before. Everything was ready. But the morning of the service, I went out to check the grave one last time, and it was already filled in." "What do you mean, filled in?" "I mean someone had filled it in overnight. Fresh dirt, like the burial had already happened. But there was no casket in it." "I don't know. I didn't dig it back up. I reported it to the cemetery director. He told me to dig a new grave in the adjacent plot and not to talk about it." D1422. "Yeah, how'd you know?" "Because his headstone is there." "Right, so I dug the new grave and we buried him there on November 9th. Quiet service. No one asked questions." "Did you ever find out who filled in the first grave?" "No, and I didn't want to. Some things you just leave alone." I thanked him and hung up. I sat in my truck in the dark cemetery parking lot, trying to make sense of everything. 2 graves, same plot. Different times, one casket on top of another, the ledger entry that appeared and disappeared, the tapping sound. I didn't go back to work the next day. I called in sick. I needed time to think, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every explanation I came up with led to more questions. 3 days later, I got a call from Olivia. Her voice was shaking. "Nathan, you need to come to the office." "What's wrong?" "Just come." I drove to Elmwood. Olivia was standing outside the administration building with Lucas and 2 people I didn't recognize. A man and a woman, both in their 50s. "These are Walter Henning's daughters," Olivia said. The woman stepped forward. "We heard there was some confusion about our father's grave." I didn't know what to say. "We want to see it," she said. We walked out to Section D. I led them to D1422, where the headstone was. "This is where he's buried," I said. The woman knelt down and touched the stone. "We were at the service, November 1987. I remember it clearly. Do you remember anything unusual?" I asked. She looked up at me. "Like what?" "Like a delay or a change in plans." She glanced at her sister. "There was a delay. The funeral home said there was an issue with the plot. We had to wait a few weeks." "Did they explain why?" "No, we just assumed it was some kind of paperwork problem." I looked at Lucas. He looked at Olivia. None of us knew what to say. The woman stood up. "Why are you asking about this?" I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't tell her that her father might be buried in 2 places at once, or that I'd heard tapping from under the ground, or that a ledger entry had appeared and vanished. "Just routine record keeping," I said. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push it. After they left, Lucas, Olivia, and I stood in the cemetery in silence. "What do we do?" Olivia asked. "Nothing," Lucas said. "We don't have an explanation, and we're not going to get one. We leave it alone." "We can't just leave it," I said. "Why not?" Lucas said. "What's the alternative? Exhume both graves? Explain this to the families? Explain it to the state?" He was right. There was no good option. I left Elmwood Memorial Gardens 2 months later. I told everyone it was for personal reasons. I got a job with a landscaping company in Indianapolis, an hour and a half away. I still think about D1423. I think about the tapping. I think about Michael Butler digging a grave that was already filled. I think about the ledger entry that appeared and disappeared like it was never there. I've tried to find rational explanations. Clerical errors, subsidence causing the sound, false memories, but none of them fit. The truth is, I don't know what happened. I don't know if Walter Henning is buried in one plot or two. I don't know who or what I heard under that ground. But I do know this. Some places hold on to things, events, mistakes, repetitions. And some of those things don't follow the rules we think govern the world. I still drive past cemeteries sometimes. I see the groundskeepers working, the backhoes digging, the families gathered for services, and I wonder if any of them have ever stood over a grave and felt the certainty that something is deeply, impossibly wrong. I don't go back to Fort Wayne. I don't call Lucas or Olivia anymore. I don't check the records, because some questions don't have answers, and some answers are worse than the questions. If you've ever worked in a place long enough, really worked there, learned its rhythms, trusted its systems, then you know what I'm talking about. You know that moment when everything you thought was solid suddenly isn't. When the ground under your feet becomes uncertain. That's what happened to me. And I'll never forget it.